This is the third event in a series of webinars co-hosted by the SIG and the CUFA Scholars of Color Forum. Throughout this series, we'll discuss and have discussed issues related to racial justice, equity, and inclusion in social studies, teacher education, and research. We are honored to have a distinguished group of panelists here with us today. First, Dr. Noreen Naseem Rodríguez, Assistant Professor in the School of Education at Iowa State University. She employs critical race frameworks to explore Asian American educational experiences, diverse children's literature, and the teaching of difficult histories to young people. Welcome, Dr. Rodríguez. Also, we have Dr. Saleh, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Education at Concordia University of Edmonton, a former elementary and secondary school teacher and the author of Stories We Live and Grow By, retelling our experiences as Muslim mothers and daughters. Welcome, Dr. Saleh. And additionally, we have Dr. Shear, Assistant Professor of Social Studies and Multicultural Education at the University of Washington, Bothell. Dr. Shear examines K-12 social studies curriculum within Indigenous contexts, as well as race and racism and settler colonialism in K-12 social studies teacher ed, popular media, and qualitative methodologies. Hello, Dr. Shear, and welcome. Before we begin, we have a few expectations for participants. First, those of you in the audience, we ask that you keep your microphones on mute and cameras off throughout the event. This will help with managing bandwidth and keep focus on our panelists. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please share it in the chat feature. Dee Hall, a doctoral candidate at the University of Texas at Austin and chair of the CUFA Scholars of Color Forum, will be curating questions from the chat to facilitate the Q&A discussion that will come at the end. Additionally, we expect that comments shared in the chat feature are respectful, thoughtful, and appropriate. If any comments are shared by the audience that distract from the purpose of this event or are racist, sexist, homophobic, or in any way derogatory, we reserve the right to remove audience members from the session. Zoom bombing will not be tolerated. All right. That's enough of that. Let's get right into the conversation. So I'd like to begin by giving each of you a few minutes to discuss the following. When you think about the topic of today's conversation, politics of citation, what comes to mind? Give you a couple, 2 to 3 minutes for each of you to kind of share your opening thoughts. Dr. Rodríguez, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much to the SIG and to the Scholars of Color Forum for inviting us. This is a great panel. It feels like we're just kind of having the conversation today that we've been having for years. So I'm so happy to be a part of this. When I think about the politics of citation, I feel like it's a tension between two main things. So first, the people that I feel required to cite, typically what we understand as the canon, folks who have work that is considered essential to the field, but often that can also just be, if you want to publish in a certain journal, are they requiring you to cite people who have published work around this topic in that journal, right? So it's around this idea of constraint and obligation versus, and I tried to find the person who tweeted this and I couldn't, but someone tweeted a really brilliant thought that citations can also be love letters, that they are a way for us to acknowledge the footsteps in which we step, and the work that has come before us, the work that inspires us, that drives us to apply these ideas in different contexts and in new ways. And so figuring out that tension, because often we're taught to do the former and not to do the latter, or the latter is not seen as rigorous. So for me, the politics of citation is trying to figure out if we should balance that, if we just need to forget the first part initially and stop teaching that as a way to do things, or for folks who don't necessarily have the experience or guidance to know how to navigate the first, how we can try to support folks in thinking through some of those ideas.
That's great. I love the idea of citation as a love letter. That's really a heartwarming way to think about the work that we engage in. Dr. Saleh, could you share your thoughts as well?
Okay, so I'm going to apologize because I'm going to take hopefully not much more than the few minutes that you've given us so that I can really unpack some of what I'm thinking with. And I did write something just because I know that I will forget. And so I always use some sort of writing to help to guide me because I can go all over the place in my thoughts. So رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So thank you, Andrea, and all of the organizers of today's discussion. As some of you know, I am a narrative researcher. So I invite you to make yourself a little comfortable for the, or maybe also welcome some discomfort for the story I feel the need to tell this evening, or today actually. So when I was invited to be on this panel, I was, and I am honored to be here alongside my fellow panelists and you all. But I'm also feeling very nervous and unsure. Why? Because I'm a little embarrassed to admit, my first encounter with the concept of citational politics was actually just a few years ago, after I graduated from my doctoral program. Don't get me wrong, I've always believed it's important to draw upon the work of those who live and work at what Kimberly Crenshaw theorized as the intersections of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, colonialism, ableism, and other systems that come together to create unique forms of violence. In my dissertation and research alongside Muslim women and girls, I purposely foregrounded the work of Muslim women as often as possible. However, while this has always been a personal preference and commitment, I now understand that citational practice is an inherently political act that creates worlds and disrupts others. So long story short, my fellow panelist, Dr. Noreen Rodríguez, who I was best to get to know at CUFA in 2017, encouraged me to apply for the 2019 Curriculum Inquiry Summer Writing Fellowship. So I did. And alhamdulillah, I was accepted, but I was a little surprised at the editorial board's response to my application. They encouraged me to rethink who I was citing. I was encouraged to read Dr. Saleh Ahmed's work in specific, and so I did. And doing that literally changed my life, and not only my scholarly practice. I don't have time to give a sense of how and why engaging with her work changed me so profoundly. So instead, I'm going to tell this story. And I'm going to illuminate why rooting our scholarship in the work of those making lives at the intersections of violent systems, those who are too often not read or cited, is so important, particularly as I engage in research that delves into the lived experiences of different forms of dis-citizenship, and I'm using dis with a backslash, alongside Muslim mothers of disabled children who originally arrived here as refugees. Work that for some apparently is, quote, not really social studies. In her blog post titled Creating Feminist Paths, Dr. Saleh Ahmed writes, if we can create our paths by not following, we still need others before us. Those who, even if they began on the right philosophical tracks, end up being, quote unquote, derailed. So I understood this to mean that what is often seen as a derailment from certain citational practices and forms of scholarship can create paths, not only for ourselves, but those who come after us. And so here I'm thinking about my experiences at CUFA a few years ago, where I was forced to push back against the work that framed the teaching about Muslims and Islam in a way that can only be described as a form of what Edward Said so powerfully conceptualized as Orientalism. Because in that work, Muslim equals other, an other that was nowhere to be found in the writing, framing, or citations, an other that only lives in the imaginations of the writers and others who aren't Muslim. In another blog post titled Making Feminist Points, Dr. Ahmed explained how long-standing screening techniques, such as citational practices, have historically been and continue to be how certain bodies take up spaces by screening out the existence of others. She repeatedly stresses that citations are structures that form disciplines, brick by citational brick, and how these structures are thus often experienced as walls because, quote, the reproduction of a discipline can be the reproduction of these techniques of selections, ways of making certain bodies and thematics core to the discipline, and others not even part. And here's where I name the silences and erasures around Palestine and Palestinians in social studies education. This even as so many continue to cite Edward Said, whose work was rooted in his grief and longing as a dispossessed Palestinian. However, as usual, the spirit and intent behind his work and other works by scholars of color are often erased, and our words and framings are colonized and co-opted to make them more palatable for others. But alhamdulillah, my friend and Palestinian sister, Dr. Hanadi Shtara, has a forthcoming chapter that will inshallah create many paths for me and countless others to follow. In Living a Feminist Life, Dr. Ahmed writes, citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before. Those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow. She names the issue of what she termed intellectual genealogy. For me, this is related to the acknowledgement in Islamic scholarship of identifying yourself and your work within a certain chain of intellectual tradition, mentorship, and scholarship. I'm also thinking about the growing calls and campaign to cite Black women in our work. In her article, The Professional is Political, on citational practice and the persistent problems of academic plunder, Dr. Brittany M. Edwards discusses how Cite Black Women recovers historically disappeared voices, perspectives, and practices, while providing a model of intellectual engagement that is not reducible to the professionalized, intellectualized work of the academy, because it, quote, teaches us that if we are to imagine feminist futures and have as their animating ethos commitments to justice and full liberation, then we must listen to and engage with the scholarship of diverse scholars and incorporate their voices into the core of our disciplinary practices and curriculums. Dr. Edmonds forwards many provocations in her article, but this is one I continue to think with and invite you to ponder as well. She stresses that Cite Black Women is a campaign that implicitly asks, quote, how do we critique an institutional space with the very practices that reproduce it as such? Here I am thinking about my brilliant friend and soon-to-be Dr. Tiana Dawitin, and how alongside writing and presenting in more traditional ways, she's co-hosting a wonderful podcast entitled Black and Intellectualish. So subscribe now, by the way. And I wonder if this is recognized in the Academy as a wonderful form of creating paths. I think of how I'm learning not only from the amazing written work and presentations of Dr. Lailani Sabzalian and Dr. Kristen Duncan, but also from their Twitter threads and online engagement. Is their teaching in these spaces recognized as an important form of scholarship? I think of how so many of us are working alongside our many communities in other ways, in ways not ordered by traditional academic structures, and how we are creating paths and building worlds in these spaces. And I wonder if these forms of learning, knowing, and being can ever be fully appreciated. And so, as what Dr. Saad Ahmed calls a proud killjoy, I am joining the voices of my sisters here and so many others in many different spaces who continue to name the problem of citational silences and exclusions, and specifically in social studies education. For as Dr. Ahmed asserted, we have to hold on as these histories are not gone. And that's what I'm thinking with.
Thank you. So much to consider there and sit with. Dr. Shear, could you share some opening thoughts around that question too? What comes to mind when you think about the politics of citation?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this conversation. And I'm speaking to you today from the homelands of the Tulalip Nation. And I think about the politics of citation in much the same way that I think about the ways that settler colonialism and other supremacist mindsets have allowed for the establishment and continuation of oppressive structures on the lands in which we live and in the schools in which we work and the very spaces in which we operate. And that also goes to the page and the space that words take or give, and whose knowledge and whose voice is given that space to tell the story of what we're learning and provide, as been shared previously, right? The genealogy of our learning, right? Whose words are teaching us and what are we showing of ourselves on the page through who we cite, right? Because even if we do not provide a statement of positionality, we are demonstrating our positionality in a number of ways on the page, but it's especially clear in the citations. And we don't often talk about that enough transparently. We don't talk about, as has been brought up too, what counts as the canon, who counts as the canon, who gets to, sorry, my dogs. Who gets to, I knew that was going to happen. Who gets to count in, what social studies is, and what counts as, and who counts as having demonstrated enough that you understand our field by our citations. If we're not citing certain people, have you really read that's been posed to me in some ways, that criticism of not citing and not showing the depth, the quote unquote depth of reading, because I'm not citing, older pieces or what's the canon. I'm citing newer, more junior scholars to raise and open that space. And so I'm thinking about the ways that settler colonialism operates in citations, and the way that supremacy in its various forms operate in citations and in our field of who gets to count, whose voice counts. At what point do you get to count? Because that's something else we don't talk about enough is, have you, and this has been said to me too, you haven't earned your stripes yet. Really? What does that even mean? And the need for those of us who have power and privilege because of various identity frames have to step forward and call it out and be supportive and protective in some ways of each other and our colleagues, and especially grad students and those who don't have power in the field, because we don't talk about that either. And citations are right in there with the power struggle.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Shear, can you continue to talk a little bit more about what you've written and thought about around the use and misuse of critical theory in social studies research? How does the use of theory connect to concerns related to the politics of citation?
Sure, that this has been a really important journey that I'm still on in my own learning and conversations with colleagues about, it's not just not just using theory, right? It's our theory sections of a paper. Whose versions of those theories are we using? What is the genealogy of their writing? I'm thinking about, what's been shared about Said's work, and thinking about other lanes of theories, and how often we don't think about, talk about, and I can, even speak to, it was never challenged in my coursework to think about who it was that was writing that piece of theory that I was reading. And and who was framing their thinking. Particularly I'm thinking about conversations my colleagues and I have been having around post-structuralists. We're looking at Marx, and looking at Foucault, and and Deleuze, and Guattari, looking across the, okay, so we're looking largely at European white men. What has framed their thinking around these, right? What, how deep are we going in considering the epistemology of their line of writing? How are we challenging, even within critical theory, where we are attaining our learning, and how are we ourselves in that place as well when we then put forth work? And I always think about it with the way that Kuntz talks about responsible methodology. Right? We have to sit and ask the questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, whose wisdom, whose teachings are informing it, and what's the impact that could potentially have, before we do it. And it's not just enough to say, I'm using critical theory. It's not just enough to say in a piece of writing that we're doing, social justice work. Whose social justice work are you using to frame your argument? And citations are very much a part of that. Whose work are you centering, and whose work are you lifting up? And asking readers to take consideration of. Or is it a replication of what's already been done, a replication of the canon, a replication of supremacist structures within academia and within, the publishing, world? And that's been a big issue I've faced with my colleagues who are on this Zoom, getting pushback from reviewers and editors saying, this isn't this, and this is a quote, this isn't real work. they didn't know the citations. They had never read any of those pieces. So it's not real. How could it be? Social studies doesn't do this work, so it's not real. That in and of itself is a whole reason to have something published. Like, why are we staying just circling the same story, the same narrative, the same citations? And so I think it's not just enough to say that we're critical theorists or in that realm. We have to dig deep and really start to unpack who's critical theory and where did they learn and how is that impacting our understanding. And helping graduate students too, you know, and in the 3 minutes of time that you have in grad school, really to, you know, to learn all the things, which is another Zoom entirely about how we train grad students. But you know, having space to think about where the knowledge is coming from, I think is really something that it's a lifelong journey and something we should be doing.
Yeah, it's not just enough to have the parenthetical citation that you saw someone else that you admire have, right? We have to think about the ways that we interact with those works, that genealogy, as you mentioned, and what it means to us in our specific context, our specific projects, and what we're trying to kind of contribute in the conversation. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Saleh, much of your work has addressed the relational nature of learning, knowing, and research. Can you speak to how you centralize those concerns when you're thinking about relationships and also conducting research, and where the politics kind of sit within all of that?
Definitely, again, thank you so much. I'm sitting with what both Noreen and Sarah shared already as well. And Sarah's words specifically about graduate studies and how I didn't even consider the politics of citation as something I need to be thinking with and engaging with during my graduate studies, but also how it was lived out in terms of when I asked to have somebody from within my community who's not necessarily in academia because we couldn't find anybody to be on my committee. I was told that that's not okay to do. That's not how we do things here. And so I was flat out denied because I wanted to make sure I was honoring of my community. But I also think about this recent paper that I wrote to honor, well, I've written about this concept in a few papers, but to honor my Siti, my grandmother, Siti Shrifi al-Bukhari, alayhi yarhamah. And really what she taught me as a Palestinian dynamic and amazing woman through her curriculum of Rahma. And so the word Rahma in English translates to mercy. However, through that translation, it is too simplified because the root of the Arabic word Rahma is Rahim or womb. So for many Muslim and or Arabic language speakers, Rahma carries with it a sense of tender and loving nurturance, compassion, and sustenance. However, I talked about our familial curriculum making and how I learned, so because it is a form of curriculum making, it is a form of engaging with curriculum and knowledge, and how Siti continually reminded me that that love and compassion, that rahma, inherently dwell alongside equity and justice. And so I wove together that knowing, that original knowing, and that ongoing, you know, those stories that have been planted in me and that's are growing still within me, alongside works by Bell Hook, Audre Lorde, Maria Lugones, and Bettina Love, and also a dear friend and mentor, Dr. Janice Huber, and another good friend, Dr. Dwayne Donald, and what he conceptualizes as ethical relationality. And still I get asked, this is lovely, and this is literally a quote, this is lovely, but how does this relate to research? You know, how does this relate to social studies education? And my answer is always, how does it not? Because for me, at least, the connections and learnings are so clear. So too often we research on or about different groups of people and phenomena. Yet in doing so, we so often abstract away or theorize away lived experiences and relationships. We forget that we are part of the research landscape. We forget that to be a researcher is to live in relationship to ourselves, to participants, and all of the interconnected webs of relationships that entangle and surround us. And so for me, in research specifically, in scholarship, and in just living, my priority will always be to my relational commitments. And I try to continually ask myself variations of the following questions. How am I honoring the relational webs of which I am a part? How am I honoring my relatives, my family, and my ancestors and their teachings? How am I uplifting voices, work, and experiences that are too often ignored or silenced? How am I engaging in ways that's relational rather than this neoliberal notion of individualism? What are my intentions as I engage in this work? And how can these intentions be erased, complicated, and or forgotten in the process of trying to get yet another proposal, paper, presentation, and so forth on my CV, because I do need to keep my job? And how am I doing this in ways that will honor and benefit those who have invested time and energy and love into me and my work? And so I'm continuing to think about that as I think with the curriculum of Rahma that Siddhi taught me to engage with and live with, and at least try to embody that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Rodríguez, a thread through your research has addressed the experiences and histories of Asian American and Latinx people. As we know, these are areas under discussed and explored in educational research. What do you think is important for us to consider around issues that haven't been prominently discussed in the field before now?
So I think we often disregard or don't give proper props to interdisciplinary work. Social studies folks like you to cite just the people who are like labeled as social studies. But if I am talking about the ways that Latinx people have historically experienced citizenship, or the ways in which Asian Americans have historically been viewed as the yellow peril, we're seeing that again with all the anti-Asian violence that's happening right now as a result of COVID-19. What Walter Parker and Myra Levinson have to say about civics is not related. It does not capture those experiences. And so for me to fall back on that canon is inadequate. And you know, my mentor, La Mera Mera, Cynthia Salinas, is on this call, and she was really quick to show me that if we're going to be talking about Latinx communities, we need to get work from those communities. And so between her and my Chicano studies husband, like I found myself really immersed very early on in stuff that I never learned in school. But clearly these were the bodies of knowledge that I needed to draw from, because what was in social studies ed, what was in TRSE and JSSR was not going to give me anything that I needed. And so beginning with that kind of education and training with her, and then thinking about what I wanted to do within Asian American education, whether it's regarding Asian American elementary teachers, which is seriously understudied, or Asian Americans as they appear in the curriculum, it was just very clear that there was nothing that I could use in social studies. You know, Soyonan is also on this call, and really she had been the preeminent Asian American scholar in social studies. And now there are two of us who everyone cites when it comes to stuff about Asian American work. But like, even when people cite our work, they often cite it in ways as to just like, it's a cursory nod that there are people studying Asians. I don't study Asians, I study Asian Americans. But even when people cite my work, they misacknowledge what I do. So, you know, I think I have certainly drawn from interdisciplinary work and sometimes have to defend that, but also because there's not a whole lot of other people for me to cite. As long as I cite Soyan, they don't seem to take issue with me citing other people too, right? I've cited the social studies person I needed to cite. And I think that's where things become a little tricky for me, because I'm an interdisciplinary scholar myself. I publish a lot in social studies, but I also have been publishing a lot more in literacy spaces. And they have a much stronger canon when it comes to Asian American children's literature, for example. And I distinctly recall there was a piece where we had cited one of the few pieces that had really thought about Asian American representation in the 90s. And in rereading it for the revisions, I was like, whoa, that's messed up. I know we cited it initially, but now that I'm rereading it, those are really antiquated ways of understanding the model minority stereotype. And actually, I don't want to cite that anymore. And so they were expecting me to cite it. I already had. And I remember writing a letter to the editor saying, look, I know I cited these particular scholars, but I'm taking that out, even though I know that's pretty canonical, because I find what they said very problematic. And they didn't question that, but I think a lot of that is due to the fact that people aren't as familiar with a lot of these scholars. There is another point I was going to make, but I've lost it, so I will stop there.
All three of you, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. All three of you have kind of hinted at or talked about the publishing process. So I have, the next question speaks to that specifically. How do you carry concerns related to the politics of citation with you from manuscript conceptualization to print, from preparation to print? Can you speak a little bit to how throughout kind of each of those steps you hold these concerns in your mind? I'm realizing I'm not being a good host. I'll select one of you at random to speak. Dr. Shear, your picture is first on my list of pictures at the top. So could you share your thoughts?
Sure. It's really hard to navigate journals, especially when those journals hide behind the veil of anonymity with their reviewers, which is why I'm more and more in favor in participating in open peer-reviewed spaces, because you don't know who the editor is going to assign to read it. And sometimes, depending on the journal, the editor themselves is a problem that you have to carefully navigate. And so even just thinking about where to send a piece as it's being conceived is an important, conversation to have with, oneself or colleagues if it's a, co-written piece. And I always am thinking about the piece is the most important, and the citations within it, and uplifting and centering those citations I know need to be there, even if my feet, the field's gonna be like, who's that? Who is that? Or why didn't you cite so and so? To me, the piece and the responsibility and the commitment is paramount. Where it gets published is, of course, an essential and important conversation, because we have to, keep our jobs, which is a whole nother Zoom. But it's secondary to that commitment. I like to believe that there's always a place for something, where I'm not selling my soul to have another tick on the CV. And in that, also navigating and thinking about my advocacy work as part of that, right? There's multiple lanes in which, for myself, I travel within this problem of the politics of citation. It's, it's writing and staying true and committed to the work, and that the work demonstrates that commitment deeply all the way to the last page of the reference section. But also what I need to do and what I feel is my responsibility as I continue in my career and become more involved in spaces of power, to call it out and force as much as possible the conversation about, what journal editors are doing, what are reviewers doing, what are we doing as a field, that's either helping or continuing to harm. And so, it's a big think process, the reference section, and how that's going to land with publishing. And I think one of the biggest things for me is an exercise that we did with authors who wrote for the whiteness book, is ask them to just go look at your reference, go sit with your reference section for a little bit and see who you've cited. And, you know, make edits, revisions, additions as you see fit to speak and be clear to the commitments we're making in this text. And so that's an exercise that I'm continuing to do more of with myself. In, you know, who am I reading today? Whose stack am I, you know, about to type in? Because I don't know how to use the fancy software for citations. You know, who am I either typing or copying and pasting from a previous article into the new one, and constantly checking myself and asking colleagues and collaborators to check me too, about, you know, who we're reading and who we're centering and who we're giving voice to in that publishing space, because it shows who we are, and it's forever because it's in print. We can't take it back once it's there. And so, you know, how do we continue to grow and learn and speak transparently about that in the publishing process? And there's no real easy to do it. And I think the problem starts in grad school, because, you know, we're trained, you know, here's the 5 articles on citizenship, like Noreen was saying, here's the 5 articles on citizenship you need to cite every time you write about it. Why do we have to do that? I'm constantly like doing, like, you know, the dramatic flailing arms. I'm like, why? There's so many other amazing pieces to cite. Why do you have to do that? What are we proving? That you read? Okay. Oh no.
Yeah, Dr. Rodríguez, do you have other thoughts around the kind of carrying through the trajectory of a single piece or pieces?
I mean, I think whenever I'm starting to put together a manuscript, I already know whose work I'm trying to respond to or I'm drawing from, right? Like, those things are always clear. And I think there's a few things I've been doing more lately, as I've had more experience publishing. Like, I know that if I target a particular journal, I might have to concede certain things, right? And so when I try to submit a piece to a journal like that, I kind of like have to let certain things go and know that this is not going to be a piece that is going to let me be my full self when I write. Which is part of why more recently, when I see special issues, I jump at it, because I know that the editors for those special issues will be the ones who are actually in charge of a lot of what actually gets published. And so I don't necessarily need to deal with the nonsense politics that often happens when you have an editor that's been there for years and years and years, and it's basically whatever they want is ultimately what gets published. So for me, special issues have been a way to get into particular major journals, doing the work that I want to do and without having to make any compromises. So that's been something that I wasn't really told to do that. It's not something that I was privy to until my first experience. And I was like, oh, well, this is much better than doing like a random submission. And then you get reviewers who often totally don't understand what you're doing at all. And so you get really harsh pushback, or they don't even understand the terminology you use, right? Like, when you are doing a special issue and those editors clearly align with your politics and the kind of work that you're trying to do, you're much likely to be pushed in ways that actually improve your work rather than requiring you to adjust it in ways that you may not be comfortable with. I remember the thing I had forgotten to say earlier, which was just that, and I think this is particularly true with social studies journals, like oftentimes they want you to do formal nods to certain scholars. And sometimes those are scholars of color, but they don't actually want you to engage deeply with their work. They just want you to make sure you're ticking off the boxes. And that's something that I've become increasingly bothered by. And so one thing that I have done with a lot more intention in my more recent pieces is, if I'm going to have a block quote, it's going to be from the person that is outside of social studies. I will give that person space, and I will just, like, the simple parenthetical citation that doesn't have a whole lot of context will go to the person that's more well-known in the field. Because my hope is then maybe we can bring this other work into spaces where it should be, but people aren't necessarily engaging with it as much in this particular field. So I'm trying to be a little bit more strategic about that. Also, I'm real cynical because my colleague, Dr. Amanda Vickery, and I submitted a piece that used intersectionality, and one reviewer tore it to shreds, wanted us to cite white women when we were talking about intersectionality. They thought we had under-theorized it because we only talked about Crenshaw. I mean, it was just the most offensive review we have read in a very long time. And when I emailed the editor of that journal and let them know how outraged and upset we were, because it took us a full year to even respond because we were just so hurt by it. And I said, you know, this reviewer caused us harm. We will not be submitting anything to this journal because what are you doing when you choose reviewers? And even though you as the editor have the power to modify what the reviewer gives you before you give it to the author, you chose not to. Their response was, well, you know what, we're gonna have a special issue. Maybe you should submit to that. So only when you have a special guest editor might there be more humane treatment of authors? Like, no. So, I mean, I think part of what I have also learned is there are some places that my work will not be published in, period. And that is fine. Because for me to publish my stuff in those places would require me to do things that I don't think are ethical, or to cite people whose work I don't think is good or ethical, or both.
Wow. I kind of speechless at that feedback about intersectionality, as I think some of the audience members are too. I think kind of a related question to what you were saying, but to everyone, this comes from the audience. Can you speak to how you navigate pushback from the field or from editors when scholars are told to legitimize scholars of color when we cite them? That's the question from the audience. I'm using their words, but can you kind of talk about how you respond to that pushback or resistance you receive when you're trying to be intentional about the citations you are using and representing voices of people of color?
Okay, I can, I think, respond a little bit to this one because I was invited and it was for Canadian social studies. I'm not even going to say what the invitation exactly was because it would be very obvious, but it was for something related to Canadian social studies. And I was invited to contribute a chapter about diversity and inclusion. And so I accepted and I made it clear that I'm going to be drawing on certain commitments to racial justice specifically. And for whatever reason that editor did not understand that I'm saying I'm going to extend what diversity and inclusion are here. Anyways, long story short, the review was basically, this is not what we agreed on. If you want to be published in here, you're going to have to kind of stay in this lane. And so I just responded, thanks, but no thanks. I'm not changing nothing. So I pulled my piece and I made it very clear that that review itself was harm and doing exactly what I'm writing about here. And so that's just one example. Another one was because I typically often use the work of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, her concept of the single story. And a reviewer made it very clear that they think that I'm, that TED Talk was kind of old now, it's dated. Maybe you should look for something more newer about it. And I responded, it's funny how we can cite old dead guys, for centuries apparently, but an 11-year-old TED Talk by a Black woman who's asserting this concept that's really literally changed the way I think, it's dated. And so those are the types of, I will push back. And I know that in doing so, it might not earn me a good reputation, in all honesty, but I don't care. I think that for me, I need to have a sense of integrity. I need to feel like I'm doing this work with integrity as much as I can. And so I do prioritize open access spaces. I do prioritize, like Noreen talked about, special issues, because I know that there's a little bit less of those walls that I'll be coming up against. Knowing that is a bit of also a privilege in itself, because thankfully my university doesn't, require me to have a certain index number or anything like that. And so I wonder about the experiences of those who are in those systems, who do need to navigate those things, because that is going to be contributing to their review. And that's another kind of tensionality that I think about and live with.
So I have multiple experiences, but the relevant to this question and also to the previous one were with publishing in TRSE. Let's just name it TRSE right there. And I saw his little picture somewhere is on one of the boxes, but the piece that Dan Krutka and I published just recently, that was not the first, nowhere near the first draft or 15th draft of what that manuscript actually was. It was originally a research piece, a traditional research article, where we were sharing what we had learned and were continuing to question and consider around, the ways in which Indigenous histories and contemporary issues are taught in a school where you have a substantial Native population of students. And we were using settler colonial theory, and we were working from methodological spaces that drew from, some of the work in, kind of critical, qualitative, and post-qualitative thinking. And the work was, and I'm not kidding you, it was called fake. And it was just lambasted because of, it came down to no one understood the methodology. No one, people didn't understand the methodology. They didn't understand the theory. This is not what social studies did. I'm like, no kidding. That's why we're doing it. And it was profoundly rude and upsetting, the way in which, the piece was talked about. And, and it was presented as, where this is interesting, but the field's not going to understand this. So would you consider writing a conceptual piece where you teach people about, what settler colonial theory is? And so, we had a choice. We had to decide to pull it, or, kind of thinking about what Noreen spoke about, right? The concessions we sometimes make. And after, a couple of, screamings into the phone, thank you, Dan, for being such a good collaborator and just letting me vent. We moved forward with rewriting the entire piece, but making it a call to the field. I'm like, what the hell? What are we doing? What are we reading? How are we doing the work? Why are we doing the work? That whole, all of the structural issues that we're calling out here and beginning to talk about, right? The politics of that. And so that's what that piece became. And I guess it's a concession in a way, but it was also, to me, it was also like, I'm digging my heels in now. Like, this thing's going in TRSE. Like, people in social studies are going to read about settler colonial theory. They're going to read about why social studies is part of the problem, if not like the root of the problem, in many ways, for the perpetuation of supremacist thinking in education. And who are we citing and why? How are we making the decisions? Sorry, it wasn't a case study. My bad. I didn't know we couldn't do work that wasn't, Stake 1995. It was exacerbating. And I know, and the same thing with social studies in the young learner. Several of us on this Zoom have had that experience with SSYL literally rewriting our art, like rewriting pieces of our work because they didn't like the language and not asking if they could do it. Like, come on. There's so many things. And I know folks have had problems with JSSR in the same way, and we're not having honest conversations around the way that reviewers are being allowed to just full tilt do whatever the hell they want with a piece. It's frustrating because I don't want to take it to somewhere else. I want social studies to confront, right? But we have this barrier problem of who's in charge. And I think that goes back to, the advocacy piece that I feel responsible to as I progress and move into these spaces to say like, we're going to change this, man. Like we have to. That's why people leave social studies. So, yeah.
Thank you all for sharing your personal experiences. Like they're very visceral to kind of sit with. I'm looking at our time. We have about 7 minutes left. So I have a lot of kind of emerging questions that have come from listening to all of you share your insights. But I think I want to end on a question to focus on graduate students, because all of us as faculty do work in some ways with graduate students. So I think thinking about our own experiences, maybe what we missed, what we wished we had received or had an opportunity to encounter, what kind of advice or thoughts or things to sit with do you want to share, or do you share with graduate students as they begin their journeys as scholar researchers?
Okay, so I'm that person that cannot sit with awkward silences, and so I apologize in advance. So it's kind of like the elephant in the room for me. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So once I was made aware that this is how important this is, there's no other way that I can be and engage and live in these spaces anymore. And so with graduate students, what I've been doing is from day one, talking to them about who are we citing, why is it important, who's been erased, and so forth. And so we immediately start with the reading of works that are underappreciated or not very well known, alongside some of the more established, scholars, but specifically from within, marginalized, traditionally marginalized and oppressed communities specifically. And it's for the purpose of just starting from there, rooting it from there. That's not just an add-on. It's literally from the very ground up. And so that's how I try to engage and just move that path in different ways and allow for those footsteps to be followed, inshallah.
Like Mana, I talk about it very early on. One thing that really struck me, and I use Twitter all the time. I learned so much from Twitter. And on Twitter, qualitative scholar Kakali Bhattacharya was talking about how we need to stop using secondhand sources when we talk about qualitative methods. And that blew my mind. Because when I was in graduate school, we used those secondhand sources to learn about the different kinds of methods. And I intentionally requested to teach an intro to qualitative methods class so I could learn who came up with all of this stuff originally before it was in Patton or Merriam or Cresswell. So it was kind of like a personal mission of my own. And then I really started talking a lot more explicitly about the politics of citation when I started to teach those classes, because it was something that I had always wondered about, but we didn't really talk about when I was in graduate school. And I wanted to be able to have those conversations with my students. I think also because of the Me Too movement, it became very clear that for too long, people had protected trash bag human beings, abusive human beings. Why would we cite people who we know to be harmful in the field? If people were letting that go before, I was not responsible for that. But if I'm responsible now for training folks, we're just not going to do that. Like, if you know someone is unethical, don't cite them. If you've heard that they've stolen work from a grad student, from a woman, from a marginalized person, do not cite them. They're on the shit list. Done. Like, I don't see anything wrong with that if we are to be ethical researchers. And so I'm very clear and pointed with my students about that. But I'm still learning, and Twitter is a great space for that learning. But that's definitely a place that I'm very clear with my grad students about, and that I try to model in the work that I do now in ways that I wasn't necessarily thinking as deeply about when I was in grad school myself.
I think I have less advice for the grad students other than to, please don't leave us, and continue to be the brave people that you are, and read and ask questions and write bravely as you do, and don't, as much as it sometimes feels lonely or the Everest that you'll never be able to get over, you will. And there's more of us out there than it might seem who are wanting change too. And I think that's then our responsibility to be more, public, as been shared with, Twitter and Facebook, and put ourselves out there. And I think especially I want to call to my colleagues who have identities, particularly racially, in social studies, as as white scholars who have held the mic for the last 100 years. Put it down. And when we're invited to spaces like this and are honored with the ability to share, to call ourselves out that we need to do more work. We're not doing enough. And we need to not, especially once we graduate and get the job or get tenure and move on, not sit on our laurels. And it shouldn't be easy, but it doesn't have to be this hard for our colleagues to have their voices elevated and to have space to to speak truth and to publish and to ask new questions and to change who we are, because we're capable of changing. We just have to own up to the fact that social studies has been a problem, and do the work to change it. And we have to change ourselves. We have to do it ourselves, and be open to our colleagues and our friends, and as they have become family, in helping us by saying, hey, take it, hold on a minute, and take that as the potential to grow and do better. And I think especially as I'm nearing like the 10-year mark, and where are the senior scholars? Where'd they go? There's some, many, as some are on this call, are calling out and doing that work in advocacy, but but we can't become complacent once we find the success. We have to push. We have to push on, and we have to examine whose voices we're counting as counting, and whose space are we need to make more for.
Thank you. And that brings us right to time. I want to thank extremely Dr. Naseem Rodríguez, Dr. Saleh, and Dr. Shear for their time and thoughts and engagement with all of us today. So much for us to think and sit with and take with us. So thank you very much. In terms of the SIG, we have more events coming. Stay tuned, but thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.